Hello everyone, and today I'll be taking a look at the developer diary for the 19th century grand strategy game Victoria Free, which talks about the implementation of nationalism into the game. Now, nationalism, as anyone who's ever tried will explain to you, is something that is easy to identify, hard to explain. We can all sort of know what it is, because in a sense most of us do feel it on some level. But it is very hard to explain what it is, what's a nation, what is nationalism, how did it come about, when did it come about, how did these mixtures of different identities suddenly come together, and in this case, how do you implement that into a game? And there's also the question of how do we deal with all of the people, all of the anomalous identities that don't quite fit into the definitions and models of nationhood that have been constructed. Now, for the game, you need this abstraction. You need to do something that will make this very complicated topic not simple, but workable. And what would be the purpose of that force, that social force that is nationalism in the game? So one way of attempting to depict that is through the implementation of what they call subjecthood. Now, that is a new quote-unquote citizenship law in the game that is modeling the multinational empires that don't define themselves as leading a nation, but that are realms of a ruling dynasty. When Emperor Franz I of Austria has to begin dealing with the nationalist question in the early 19th century, and he starts getting these stories and reports of the national movements, in one instance he asks the question, are they loyal to me? Because that is what defined an Austrian until the end of the Habsburg Empire, until the end of Austria-Hungary. And this subjecthood is depicted by the state not really caring about a population's national identity. There is a slight preference toward what is called a primary culture for the country, because there is some level of discrimination. For the Austrian example, what we would call Germanization, it was never in Austria about assimilating the other parts of the empire into a German culture. It was always about trying to manage an empire. When Maria Theresia and Joseph II and later the mid-19th century Austrian administration demand that German be learned and spoken, they are doing it for making bureaucracy easier. And always that causes a backlash among the other peoples of the empire. And this is when we start to see the language movements really take off. So when there is backlash against Joseph II's policies, the Hungarians, for instance, start to demand that Hungarian be the official language of their part of the realm, which then causes another backlash from the Croatian population, but I'm getting off track, I'm digressing. And you can see in those movements already some aspects of what would be a nation state, a state that is composed of one nation. And whether or not somebody is accepted as part of the nation depends on the citizenship laws of that nation. So one case being subjecthood, there's other laws that change these modifiers around a lot based on the different traits that your culture has. So some are more common to more people than others. How they're trying to model things, like for Austria, is that subjecthood creates a very close acceptance level to the primary culture. As you can see, primary culture here in subjecthood is accepted at +50. Now, a culture that lives on its cultural homeland, so Hungarians in Hungary, Croatians in Croatia, Czechs in Bohemia, Czechia, they also gain an acceptance bonus to increase it very near to the primary culture. So they get roughly the same opportunities in their own homelands as the Germans do in every other part of the empire. Now, one of the values that matters in the game is this new cultural fervor, or nationalist fervor, should we say. At the lower values, people of certain cultures are just not identifying with a larger nation. They identify with their locality, they know people around, but they don't feel like they belong to something bigger. And if you are running a multinational empire, that is good. You're trying to keep people appeased and not wanting something more. But the game won't work like that, because there will be factors, other factors, many external factors driving this cultural fervor, this national fervor upwards, and creating a problem for you, because all of these cultures will suddenly start demanding and wanting things like more recognition, more things, their own nation, their own country. This factors into the culture on a global level, as I understand it. Cultural fervor can grow somewhere else and then reflect back on the domestic population, like the Polish immigrants in Paris, or as the developer diary states, the Irish immigrants to the US, that increases the cultural fervor of the overall global Irish population and creates problems for the British back home. Now, how does cultural fervor grow? Well, it grows through there being an independent country that will promote its own culture and its own feeling of identity. That is what Serbia did in the 19th century. Then you have a number of casualties in the war. This ties into the nationalism that is felt in the British colonies, like Canada, Australia. These nations suddenly have their own identity because of a collective feeling of struggle. Cultural fervor is also driven up by high literacy rates and numbers of academics. Everyone teaching and discovering things about themselves, their own identity, and forming that into new ideas, books, that then spread awareness of nationhood. Then there's, again, we tied again to education, with the primary culture of a country when applicable educational institutions. So schools play a vital part in our citizenship education, our education of our identity, education of our belonging to something greater than ourselves and our family and our town. But this nationalist fervor can also decrease if a population is feeling accepted in the country it is in. If you are feeling completely accepted, not discriminated against, you will not feel a fervor to suddenly rise up and demand your own nations, to secede, to rebel, and so on and so forth. Now, what are the effects of this cultural fervor? What happens if cultural fervor is high? Well, the more a culture is aware of its national identity, then they become resistant to assimilation. They refuse to become part of another cultural identity, and they start to campaign for their own culture. While in a country that has the majority population belonging to that nation, and that nation has a high fervor, when they're willing to endure more, they are more loyal to the state. They're also adding in factors that if these cultural movements become dissatisfied with you, they will start being obstinate. They will start to refuse to cooperate. They will start to do everything they can to peacefully dissent without outright violence. Now, these national movements, they can spread outside of the borders of the realm that is having the most problems with them, because the entire culture is hearing stories and feels affected by this. So if, for instance, here, if the Polish in Russia are dissatisfied, they will cause dissatisfaction with the Polish in Prussia, Germany, and the Polish in Austria. And if there is a nation that, for instance, exists with the primary cultural identity, for instance, here in Romania, well, Romanians can support the nationalist movements for Romanians in Hungary. Now, this this whole thing is attempting to simulate a wide variety of different kinds of nationalism, and I would say that it covers a lot of ground in a very good way. So you have the already homogeneous nationalism of nation states in different ways with different levels of acceptance, where like France, which is a bit more accepting of people just coming in and calling themselves French than, say, other nation states that demanded that a person be physically descended from that nation. I think it also covers the parts of nation building that are tied to, well, war and struggle, like the Napoleonic Wars. The wars against France were catalysts for the German and Russian national identities to begin their national awakening processes. They were built on previous existing foundations, but the Napoleonic Wars really spurned them into a new sort of movement. One in which case, in Germany's case, that is a very down to up movement. It becomes popular with the middle classes of the country before it becomes popular with the upper and lower classes of the country. While in Russia, it is a very top-heavy movement where the nation building becomes of interest to the state. Then you have the movements that exist in other countries where there is an elite that isn't exactly at the top of the ladder, but is trying to define itself against pressures from other elites, like in Austria-Hungary, where the elite first becomes interested in nation building. I haven't seen it as an example here, but it seems possible that you can also get something like the ascent of the modern Macedonian nation, where suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, this population rebels against the oppressive Turkish policies and later struggles to also define itself against the Bulgarian, Serbian, Greek nations around them that all coveted that land and, well, that population, and thought that that population was part of their own nations. But because of this fight against the Ottomans and different oppressive groups, they start to define themselves with their own national fervor and so on and so forth. I think this does a good job of attempting to model something that is difficult to model, something that is very abstract, something that has a lot of edge cases and anomalies. I like what I'm seeing. I think it is abstracting and modeling things in the right way. I especially like the inclusions of academics as a factor, academics of a certain culture in the percentage of population, and that it doesn't matter where that culture lives to spur on nationalist feelings among the culture as a whole. I like that system. That means that you can't just ignore things that are happening outside of your country, and other countries have tools to begin affecting you in some way. So it's very nice, it's very interesting, and I hope this will be fun. So, see you next time, and have a nice day.